what I'd like to do today is I would like to, in honor of today's memorable day being July 14th, I would like to say something about the French Revolution. And I think it's important that we understand the French Revolution because the French Revolution is one of the first events in history, as I was saying in an earlier class, that led to philosophical reflection. As I was telling you earlier, Kant would meditate on the events of the French Revolution, trying to understand their philosophical consequences. I think also it's the case that many of the problems that we face in society today that are genuine questions of political philosophy, for example, what is the nature of democracy? What is the relationship between democracy and human rights? What is the relationship between church and state? Many of these questions it's the same old questions that go back to the ancient cities, but the French Revolution is a moment where they're recast, I think, in a new way. And certainly you can say there's a before and after of the French Revolution as far as some of these questions of political philosophy and what kind of emphases are given to the way the questions are framed. And there's so much to say, but maybe I'll say a few things in general today, and then as in the next few days we might go into some more specifics. But just a few things in general, that basically from the Renaissance to the French Revolution, or from the Reformation to the French Revolution, one way to understand the big conflicts in Europe is to understand them as England versus some Catholic power, right? So, right, coming out of the Reformation, you have England versus the Spanish Empire. And at the time, remember, the Spanish Empire was the Netherlands, Austria, and Spain, and then, of course, the New World. There's all sorts of interesting things we could say about that. But from the standpoint of political economy, I think one of the reasons you can say that over time England won, it wasn't because God was on their side necessarily, but that Spain essentially ran her empire on a mercantile economy. Trying to use gold to pay off debts. And almost all the gold that Spain extracted from the ancient world, or from the New World, went into paying off her debts. So one of the foreign policy arms of the English during the time of her conflict with Spain were pirates. Right? Pirates would steal. They would capture and then steal the gold from the Spanish galleons coming back from the New World. Right? That's how Sir Francis Drake became a sir. He worked as a pirate in the Queen's service against the Spaniards. Well, eventually the Spaniards were exhausted and they began their decline. And then the major conflict was France versus Spain. France as the rising power, Spain as consolidating her power. And that conflict comes to a head, especially in the 18th century. Already at the beginning of the 18th century, England is thinking that, so England in 1688 had her so-called glorious revolution, where the Whigs come to power, they establish parliament, they keep the king around, but the king now, the monarch is really, his power is inferior to that of the parliament. I think that by the time you get into the early 18th century, England is hoping to bring about some sort of a similar revolution in France. And I think the idea is, if France undergoes the equivalent of the Glorious Revolution, the monarch will become inferior to a legislature. And when France is a constitutional monarchy like England, France and England will become friends. I think that's the most charitable interpretation you could put on English foreign policy. And even that, I think, it still involves a revolution. So what did the British do after this? this is where Freemasons come into the picture. By the way, there's this book by Barruel, Abbe Barruel. He was a French exile priest in England during the time of the French Revolution, and he wrote a book about this thick on the Illuminati and their role in getting the French Revolution going. And Barruel's book, I think, is very instructive because, and it's always one of the problems of good books or respectable books. Usually, there's something they get right and something they get wrong. And I think in the case of Barruel, what he definitely got right, because he had access to the letters, is describing the conspiracy that was going on between Voltaire and Diderot and D'Alembert and other French philosophes, and maybe also Toland, the role that they were playing in trying to create a cultural revolution to prepare for a violent revolution. Right, so Barruel's, I think his book gets that much right. But then Barruel will argue in his book that the primary cause of the French Revolution is Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati. Weishaupt was a Jesuit seminarian who left the Jesuits, but then figured out that he could start a secret club based on the way the Jesuits were organized, but then obviously with no sacraments. But the idea behind these secret clubs that Weishaupt organized is that you would have a little circle and everybody would tell everybody else their secret sins, right? So when you want to leave the circle, you can be blackmailed, right? That's how secret societies can work.
That's why the Masons ask my friends for his secrets.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Exactly. It's a mechanism of control.
Okay.
It's a mechanism of control, right? Because you can be blackmailed if you try to leave.
Also, you feel a sort of brotherhood.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you don't want.
You feel brotherhood at the time. You think everybody loves me, right? So it's a deception, but because it's also a power move. It's a loving power move.
But don't they say like you can't under any circumstances reveal these secrets?
Exactly. But then when you leave, they can threaten to. If you leave the group, they can reveal this. That's what blackmail is. We're going to reveal these secrets if you leave the group.
Like Carl Rogers.
Yeah.
Catholic youth groups.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Who is he?
That's another story.
Sidebar.
That's a great story, but it's another story. That's the corruption in the 50s and 60s and 70s within the Catholic world. But I think on that level, Barruel got it wrong. I think the Illuminati were around during the French Revolution, but they didn't have the power that Barruel ascribed to them. So that's like he did the research, but he never found enough evidence to really. He tried to portray it as if the Illuminati had this influence, but he never backed it up with research. But he did back up with research the relationship between Voltaire and D'Alembert and a number of others, right? In kind of laying the cultural grounds for the French Revolution. So that's always part of the challenge of history. But anyway, there's this wonderful. She was a Yale historian. She did a book on the origin of Freemasonry. I think her name is Margaret Jacobs. She had 2 books on Freemasonry, and she was just she was just a secular professor, and she said, Freemasons are a reality. I'm going to research it and just write some books on it, just to show what it really is all about. So the story she tells is great because, and I forget the exact year, but it's sometime between 1710 and 1720, maybe it's 1717, is the birth of modern Freemasonry in England. And essentially, the modern Freemasons were Whigs that didn't think the Glorious Revolution went far enough. Right? That we should get rid of the king completely, establish a new morality, get rid of Christian morals. I mean, so they were willing to consider all those kinds of ideas. They were naturalists. Many of them were Lockeans, naturalists of various sorts. So they would set up these clubs, and they eventually set up a club which they called the Freemasonic Club. And essentially, the way Jacobs tells the story is that what happened is that there ended up being two kinds of Masonic clubs in England. One that was more cultural, and the other one, and ironically, the more cultural one, like we're just a bunch of buddies, we get along, those were known as blue lodges. And then the other lodges were known as red lodges, and they were the more radical lodges. And they tended to be like, we gotta get another revolution going, violent if necessary. We have to work on cultural subversion. And so what the British Foreign Service did is that the British Foreign Service incorporated the lodges into themselves to use the lodges as an arm of either controlling the colonies or of subverting nations that were opposed to England. So what the British did with the blue lodges is they exported the blue lodges to places like Canada and the United States, because they basically are at the time the colonies. Because why? Because they said, well, we don't have to overturn the order in those countries because they're not Catholic. We just have to continue friendly relations. And so the blue lodges will be very helpful for that. However, in Spain and France and Austria and Italy and parts of Germany, the problem there is that these nations are Catholic. And so if we send our radicals into these countries and we get them enamored with John Locke and the philosophy of John Locke, that will foster over time some sort of a cultural revolution and maybe even a little bit of a violent revolution. But we'll be able to control the violent revolution and come out of it with a constitutional monarchy, and we'll be able to have relative peace because we'll weaken the church in those nations, and then we'll be able to negotiate once the church is weakened. Mysteriously, Voltaire, as a young man, goes to England in the 1720s. And he comes back from England as a complete Anglophile. But he comes back from England, and I think what we know this now, which they didn't know in France at the time. At the time, when he comes back from England, he's working with the English government. He's instituted a kind of plan for subverting French culture to bring about the conditions for a violent revolution. And the way to do that is to pretend that he's a moderate Lockean, when in reality, in secret, he's a radical Lockean, or a Spinozist. Actually, he was probably a Spinozist, because by the 1760s or so, he comes out publicly as a Spinozist. And as you know from modern philosophy, Spinoza was an atheist materialist. And one of the ways you could always present yourself in polite company in France at that time was to say, at least I'm not a follower of Spinoza. I'm just a moderate Lockean. So Voltaire would oftentimes present himself as a moderate Lockean, as a way of trying to make alliances with Catholics that thought of themselves as moderate. Definitely by the 18th century in France, as I was saying earlier, there's really not a whole lot of Thomism going around. Most of the Catholic intellectuals are trained in some sort of Lockeanism, some sort of moderate Lockeanism, or they're just suspicious of Lockeanism and they're just uber Catholics, maybe followers of Duns Scotus, maybe of Bonaventure. They're uber Catholics and they're really into Sacred Heart devotions. So it's almost a little bit, they're a little bit on the fideistic side of saying we have our Catholic faith and we have our devotions, and that's the bulwark against any form of secular intrusions. So you go through, basically, Voltaire and his conspirators realized at one point, there's a few things we need to do to create the conditions for revolution. One of the things that Voltaire did, working with two British agents, John Toland, and off the top of my head, I forget the name of the other one, but they basically got control of the postal roads so that they could funnel pornography into Paris from London via the Netherlands and Belgium. That's the whole thing of the Palais Royal, the Hôtel de Ville. That neighborhood in Paris in the 18th century became a cesspool both of bad ideas, but also where they would basically get pornography. They would spread pornography. They knew, and they didn't have as scientific knowledge of pornography as we have now, but they did know that pornography made a certain segment of the population docile and weak, but they also knew that it prepared a certain percentage of the population to become violent. Because pornography can awaken in a certain males, probably some certain females too, the lust for power. Power as the strongest lust. I mean, you can go back to Augustine and you can see this reality, but they knew this. They knew this at this time as well. The other thing that Voltaire realized, along with his fellow conspirators, is that the Jesuits were a bulwark of the faith. Before the French Revolution, the Jesuits were working at every level of society. They were working with kings and princes. The Jesuits had an awesome educational system. They were educating all the future leaders of France, of Austria, of Hungary, of Poland, of Spain. They were awesome. And their work was terrific. And Voltaire and his conspirators, they realized if we're going to get this revolution going in France, we need to take out the Jesuits. So they actually were engaged in a protracted campaign over several decades to get the Pope to suppress the Jesuits. And basically it was a PR campaign of slander and distortion and, you know, coming up with books like the Da Vinci Code, but fit for that time and things like this. So finally, I think by 1768, the French and I think it was the French and the Portuguese advisors to the Vatican, who were presenting themselves in public as genuine Catholics, but they were secretly working with the British and Voltaire to get the Jesuits suppressed. They convinced Clement XIV to suppress the Jesuits. Voltaire in his letters writes about how once the Jesuits went down, like he knew victory was his as far as creating the conditions for the French Revolution. They would also do funny things, like they would stage debate. They would try to like get people to be atheists. So they would go into coffee houses and they would stage debates, like atheist versus a believer in God, atheist versus theist. But the theist was an atheist. So they would stage these debates where they would go in and they would start this debate about atheism versus theism. And it would be like a WWF wrestling match, right? The theist would seem to get the upper hand and the atheist was on the ropes. But then he would come back and defeat the theist who would walk out in shame, you know, that kind of thing. You know, just like Hulk Hogan versus, that's for the 1980s, but
No, sure.
Hulk Hogan versus
Andre the Giant.
Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3. By the way, ESPN re-showed WrestleMania 3 during the freakout. It was one of the things that they showed as like greatest moments in sports history. It shows you all sports is fake. It's all the fix is in. WWF does support Trump in general. That's true. Yeah.
You almost understand a little bit that Enem is driving these figures like
I think Voltaire says as a 14-year-old man, he made a sort of a pact with the devil that his goal in life was to crush the church. I think there must have been, obviously the moderate Lockeans who were involved in this, they must have, if they were genuine moderate Lockeans, they must have genuinely thought that some sort of constitutional monarchy would be more peaceful. I think by this time, a lot of people were motivated by the fear of another religious war, like the religious wars that broke out at the end of the Reformation. You know, so they wanted to create a political system where you could tame any sort of religious impetus that would lead to violence. And I think there were others that were just interested in making money. And so they saw the current regime as not an easy way to make money. Like, so at the opening of the French Revolution, my sense from the study of those who were from southern France, the Girondins, they were kind of, I don't think they like believed or didn't believe in God too much, kind of like the American founders. but they just wanted to do business. They just wanted to be businessmen, make money.
Easier.
So they wanted the church off their back because the church puts limitations on what's just and unjust in contracts and economic contracts. And they wanted the monarch off their back because the monarch would collect taxes to support his central government. So also then, as we said, leading up to 1789, there's an impetus towards the spread of pornography. And I'll say, so I want to say one more thing. So the French, and we all know, we all who've grown up in America, we've heard about the French and Indian War, right? I think a great little trip you could do in the United States, in upstate New York, would be Kateri Tekakwitha, the first Jesuits up there, the Jesuit missions, reading James Fenimore Cooper, the Deer Slayer, not Last of the Mohicans, but the Deer Slayer, and talking about nature and law and how you tame savage men, right? That would be a great trip. I think you could do it very well. Educational plus travel, hiking, visiting the Kateri Shrine of the North American Martyrs, go to Niagara Falls. There's all sorts of great things there, upstate New York. But that's also the place of the French and Indian War, right? And the French and Indian War, one of the things that it did is it exhausted the French reserves, their financial reserves. So after the French and Indian War, they're going through a big economic crisis. And you get to 1787, and basically through internal jockeying that's going on in France, they convince the king that he needs to call the Estates General. So what the king does is he says, okay, we're going to call the Estates General to discuss the real problems of France. And he does this in 1787. For the next 2 years, anybody that wants to express any problem that they think should be addressed can write down a little note, and we'll put those notes in folders. And that's what we'll study at the Estates General. We'll study how to address the problems of the people. Now, there is one good thing about Marxist scholarship that you got to give them credit for. Marxist theory is so bad. Whenever a theory is really bad, the person that's trying to justify that theory can't just justify it based on one or two examples, because one or two examples will never justify it. So in order to justify the theory, the Marxist has to do an infinite amount of research. They have to gather infinite information. Why? Because they have to get enough information that they can configure it in such a way that it fits with their theory. It's like bad medical ethics textbooks. Like, medical ethics is very simple. You just need to understand what the object of the action, the intention is, and the circumstances. If you're committed to doing good, medical ethics is not that hard. It's only hard if you want to rationalize something that's bad. That's why medical ethics textbooks are always like this. Because it's always people trying to rationalize killing, or putting someone to death, or, not treating these people, or, killing, in one way or another. Obviously, you can talk with Father Marty Miller. He's a medical ethics expert. He can tell you there can be lots of situations where the circumstances are very dicey. And there has to be almost constant back and forth between the doctor and the priest and the medical ethicist about the nature of the circumstances. But if you're committed to doing the good, it's not that difficult to try to just be committed to doing the good, and then to figure out, the hard part is figuring out the circumstances. So I say all this to say that it's really the Marxist historians that have gone back and have read and cataloged all of these notebooks, all of these cahiers, they're called in French, these folders, these memos, right? And there's the Marxist historians that have gone back and cataloged and read all of them. And it's actually, the fruit of their research is somewhat interesting, because people were interested in stuff that you could completely imagine people would be interested in. We think the roads are not being taken care of. The bridge entering our village is falling apart. We have pride in our town government, but nobody seems to take care of the town government building. It needs a new roof, right? Ideas for how commerce could be better directed into our city or out of our city. We have these projects, we have these agricultural products, and they always sit here and rot, and nobody takes them away. So the Cahiers have nothing to do, almost nothing to do with like advancing democracy or human rights or anything like that. They tend to be very practical, very much centered around things like improving infrastructure, what we would call improving infrastructure, right? Or improving the means of communication. Most of the people actually complain that they think that their nobles should be better taken care of because most nobles by this point are poor and they live with the people, but usually they live almost isolated with the people and they don't have they're not that well taken care of. So, but in 1787, what happens is that there are clubs in Paris especially, and these clubs decide, well, they've announced 1789, so we're going to plan in 1789, we're going to plan for when the Estates General meets, we're going to use it to try to bring about a major overhaul of French government. So we're going to use the pretext of talking about infrastructure and taxation and finances and things like this to get a major overhaul of the French government. Also leading up to 1789, especially July 14th, 1789, a person who actually is very popular leading up to those days is the Marquis de Sade. Right? The Marquis de Sade he wrote pornographic novels, just to put it clearly. And a lot of the things he describes in his novels, he acted out. So as it turns out, he ended up, as of April of 1789, he was one of the prisoners in the Bastille. And in fact, he was probably the most known prisoner in the Bastille. And he, going into May and June and then July of 1789, crowds start to congregate around the Bastille. And the Marquis de Sade knows that they're there in part for him. So he would do things like in the prisons in those days, in order to get rid of your waste, you had a funnel, right? Where you would put your waste in the funnel that would then go down into the moat. So he realized that his funnel could be used as a magnifier. So he would use it, he would stick the funnel out of his bars, of his cell, and he would shout out to the crowd how he was about to be tortured, or they were going to come in and kill him, or that they weren't feeding him, basically because he knew he was riling up the crowd. So the soldiers that were guarding the Bastille, they knew that the crowds were gathering around it more and more, and so it was either 1 day or 2 days before, or the night before, the 14th, the crowds were getting really raucous. So they took all the prisoners out of the Bastille. By the way, he was in there because he murdered a prostitute. That's why he was a prisoner in the Bastille. So anyway, they moved him to a different prison. But when they rushed into the Bastille, they went to his room. He wasn't there. The crowds thought that he had been tortured or killed, maybe. And then that's when they turned on the guards. And then that's where they beheaded they beheaded the guards and then put their heads on spikes and started marching through the streets with the heads of the guards on the spikes. That, by the way, was that's an ancient practice that the French revolutionaries renewed. That a sign of regime change in the ancient world, if you took over a city, is you would take the leaders of the city and you would put their heads on pikes and parade them through the streets. So it's just a return to paganism.
What were the independents of Assad?
He was pro-democracy, and he was providing them their literature. So he was kind of a literary hero for them.
Celebrity.
Yeah. But he in a lot of his novels, there's discussions about what is the nature of true democracy. You know, the true democracy is a kind of an activity of power. I jumped a little bit ahead of myself getting to July 14th, just because I wanted to say what happened on July 14th before the end of today. But if you were to take a picture of what kind of who were marching in the streets of Paris, you know, in the back and forth between the king and the Estates General in 1789. Well, who was there? There was the king and his representatives, and there were the nobles. By this point, some nobles were what we would call early capitalists, right? They were industrialists. They were the ones that I was saying they would be interested in a little bit of change of the regime, maybe, because it would allow them it would allow them to make more money. A lot of the nobles, though, as I was saying, were poor. They had land, they had rights to land, but they really were no longer. They were no longer like majestic nobles of lore. Most of the people that were in the parliament, they were so this is part of the difficulty, right? And Dostoevsky talks about this in his novels. It's one thing to say you want to have a democracy, but one of the problems is that the peasant is never going to get genuine representation, because the peasants sent their cahiers, their memos, to their city officials, but then the city officials would send them to the clubs of Paris. And who ran the clubs of Paris? But people like the followers of Voltaire, the Jacobins, the Girondins, right? Different, basically people that had nothing in common with the peasants. They were men of letters. They were educated. They had been educated by the Jesuits. They were now atheists, materialists. Actually, a lot of the memos say things like, "We wish our priests had better living quarters." They would say things like that as well. I mean, the people didn't want to get rid of their priests. But so the problem is that who goes to the Third Estate, who goes to represent the Third Estate in the Estates General? It's mostly the men of letters in Paris, the liberals, who are both moderate and liberal, either Lockeans or by this point also Rousseauvians, followers of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Also, in those opening days of the revolution, if there were 1,000 that went to the Estates General, 300 of them were priests. And the typical priest at this moment would be a priest who is in name only Catholic. That they were not like super believing Catholics. They were not super loyal to the Pope. They were ready for France to become like England, like some sort of Franglican church.
You say typical, you mean in the whole country or just in Paris?
And the ones that were marching.
Okay.
The ones that were marching on those opening days.
Who would be the people that actually that was sent in?
Pardon?
Who would be the people that was set up to pretend to be priests?
Well, they were really ordained priests. Actually, what happens? Eventually, many of these priests will, through the suffering of the revolution, they'll come back to the church. But many of them were naturalists. You know, they didn't really believe. They thought that the church was myths, like the Gospels were myths or nice stories, but they couldn't be. Science wouldn't hold. They wouldn't hold up to what science has to offer. And certainly that we were on the dawn of a new age, and that in the new age there would be a reconfiguration of the church. And that the Church of France should be more like the Church of England, a little bit distant from the Pope. Right? So that's 300, probably, again, 300 of the priests were marching with the revolutionaries in those opening days of the revolution. Obviously, so the army is always present. The army at this time is probably mixed. Pro-revolution, pro-monarch, right? They're probably not fully united around either side. there were also, among those groups, some of them would also be Jansenists or grandchildren of Jansenists. The Jansenist movement was a very anti-monarchical movement. Sometimes people equate Jansenism with Puritanism, but it's not exactly the same. I mean, the Curie of Ars was probably a Jansenist,
Didn't like Nancy.
just to give you a sense of. I mean, they had the Jansenists had like strict morals.
Thought dancing was a sin.
Yeah, he was always berating the village girls for dancing. The Curie of Ars.
Yeah, but then most of I mean the saints who practice asceticism they were sort of very strict as well.
Yeah,
Teresa of Avila, for example, consider reading novel as a sin.
right,
You can tell.
St. Francis de Sales didn't like that.
right.
The rest of
Yeah.
But in,
Yeah, dancing doesn't come across so well in the writings of the saints.
that. It's the French one.
Yeah.
really brave.
So what happens in the French Revolution is that in those early after July 14th, there's an initial terror. There's an initial month or two of terror where there's bloodshed. But then things kind of calm down by September. And then there's a lot of jockeying back and forth where and there someone was, I was talking with someone a couple of months ago or a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying, what do you think about all these people marching right now? Right? When everyone was marching in early June or whatever. And I said, look, if this is like the French Revolution, these people will be slitting each other's throats at some point in the upcoming years. Right? So I think that's something to keep in mind, and we'll say more about this next time because we have to go soon. But that in these years from 1789 to 1793, there's a lot of jockeying between various groups, right? Followers of the Jansenists, the priests who are the priests that wanted the church to separate a little bit from Rome. Those are the Gallican priests, right? The Jacobins emerged as a party. The Girondins emerged as another party. The nobles divide into the ancient nobles and the more bourgeoisie nobles, excuse me. There's a party that develops among the people. They're known as the enragés. The enragés were basically peasants that got upset at all the revolutionaries. They were led by a priest named Jacques Roux. And Jacques Roux himself, I think he was defrocked. I don't think he continued as a priest. But they were basically enraged. They were the enraged ones. And they were enraged because this whole Estates General was meeting. All these different sides were meeting. And no one was actually discussing the needs of the peasants that was in the Cahiers. Right? So all these different groups are starting to emerge, especially from 1789 to 1793. It's in this time that we get the origin of what we now call the right and the left. Right? So the right were all of those that sat on the right side of the Estates General. They were the moderate revolutionaries. I mean, think about that. Right? The right were like the libertarians, the Girondins from the south that just wanted lower taxes and they wanted a decentralized state. They weren't so interested. They could care a little bit less about the rights of the church. Then the left tended to sit on the left side of the Estates General. And those were led by the Jacobins. And then another faction was called the Mountain. And then also on the left was also the enragés. Right? So the factions that eventually develop into what we now call the right and the left, actually that they stem from the French Revolution. They were the two sides. They were all for revolution. By the way, we're talking about people who are all for the revolution, right? They're all against the monarchy, but they disagree on, well, how far the revolution should go, and they'll be in huge disagreement when it comes to when the Reign of Terror starts. So we'll stop there, and we'll have to just start again tomorrow.